Model-based choices involve prospective neural activity. First, I'd like to introduce two learning strategies that have been proposed previously. One of these learning strategies is model-free learning, which is based on the notion that behavior is habitual. The subject simply repeats actions that have been rewarded in the past. Thus, this is a simple and inflexible strategy that does not allow for changes in behavior. For example, if a mouse got a food reward by pressing the lever on its right, it will press this lever again in the future. In contrast, model-based learning is based on goal-directed behavior. A subject makes choices about what actions to perform based on possible future outcomes and on the structure of the task. It is a more complex and flexible way to make decisions, as it allows the subject to adjust their behavior according to changes in the tasks. So what was already known about these two strategies? The brain appears to use both to make decisions. Researchers have also found that young adults with greater working memory capacity use model-based learning more than young adults with lower working memory capacity. Additionally, older adults have more difficulty with model-based behaviors compared to young adults, but this is not due to differences in working memory. Other studies have found that both strategies are associated with bold responses in the striatum and the prefrontal cortex. Finally, it's also known that choices and choice-related neural activity sometimes reflects knowledge about consequences. However, the exact nature of the processes involved in model-based decisions were unknown before this current study.
Let's start with the research question. Do choices and neural correlates of decision variables reflecting knowledge of their consequences arise from prospective evaluation? Let's try that again in English. The big question being asked here is, do people make decisions by imagining all the possible future consequences of their actions? We know that this complicated mesh of neural and behavioral mechanisms described as being model-based somehow let people make flexible choices without heavy reinforcements. We could only speculate that this kind of sophisticated series of decisions that we make every day are from prospection, a mental simulation of all choices and the assessment of their possible outcomes. But the reason why this paper is so cool is because it proved that prospection is indeed part of the complicated model-based decisions by observing the outcomes to action choices and decoding the activations of key brain regions.
But how could we test this? 23 subjects were given an MRI test protocol. Subjects were shown a series of images. The actual choice that they were asked to make was between a series of two sets of images. In stage 1, this was between either two face images or two tool images, which would then lead them to a second stage choice between two body part images or two landscape images. Depending on their stage 2 choice, they had a different chance of winning money, which, since they were offered their earnings from a certain trial, provided genuine incentive for participants to learn this paradigm. Researchers looked at what individuals were thinking about during their first choice. So, for example, when offered a first stage choice between two tools, which would then lead to some second stage choice in the future, researchers wondered what participants were considering. A catch trial, which was just a blank screen between the first choice and the second choice, allowed researchers to analyze the bold response that took place during the first choice. If prospective evaluation is indeed the method by which model-based learning is undertaken, we should see that subjects showed prospective thinking during their first choice task. However, if individuals were undergoing model-free thinking, we should see that individuals are simply thinking of the previous series of events that led to their reward, and were not able to think about the future decision they were asked to make. In order to analyze this response, participants were first shown the body parts, scenes, faces, and tool images out of context, in order to establish regions of interest that were then averaged across subjects so that we could tell when participants were thinking about each choice. In the catch trial, in individuals who are making model-based choices, there should be activation in the body parts of the brain because individuals conceptually understood that the next choice that they wanted would be the choice between body parts, which would then allow them to choose the best possibility of gaining a reward. In model-free learners, we should expect to see activation in the body part region only when the first choice was between faces. Individuals simply choose the series of choices that allowed them to get a reward last time. Unsurprisingly, a function this complex required quite a bit of analysis. Data was filtered for noise and compared against 4 general linear models. GLM-1 sought evidence of prospective activation. It assessed activation that accompanied changes in first stage state from trial to trial. So, for example, the difference between activation, where the first choice was the same for 2 runs, and where the first choice was different for 2 runs. So GLM2 assessed bold correlation with the choice values of the 2 strategies at each voxel. Functionally, GLM2 compared whether model-based or model-free learning was occurring. The effects were re-estimated by averaging effects across ROI voxels as identified in group-level analysis. GLM2 also assessed effects of prospection by looking at per-subject covariates in whole brain analysis. GLM3 assessed the relationship of neural prospection to model-based valuation across trials. So basically, GLM3 tried to determine whether neural prospection was the basis of model-based thinking. This was computed separately for the regions of interest of the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the frontopolar cortex. GLM4, it's basically GLM1, just fitted to M&I coordinates.
There were 4 key findings in this paper. 1. Behavior reflects both model-based and model-free learning. 2. Model-based behavior involves neuroprospection. 3. Neuroprospection relates to other neural signatures of model-based decision variables. And 4. Prediction error signals are related to model-free behavior and reduced prospective neural activity. The authors first differentiated between model-based and model-free learners at a behavioral level by a computer simulation. It was simulated that model-based learners were more likely to stay with a rewarding choice even if the first stage pictures were changed because they rely on a general strategy. On the other hand, model-free learners failed to do the same because their decisions were simply determined by the outcome of the previous trial. Behavior reflects both model-based and model-free learning. The second conclusion made by the authors was that model-based behavior involves neuroprospection. Interestingly, in model-based learners, even when the subjects have not yet reached the second stage, the ROIs were activated depending on what picture they were planning to choose. This suggests mental planning and thus prospection. The graph summarizes the findings. As behavior was more dependent on model-based processes instead of model-free processes, there were more prospective activation of respective ROIs. Figure 4a shows the neural activity of model-free learner at a cat trial, which is stopped after the first trial. Since the highlighted parts are derived from activation at having already chosen minus that at yet unchosen, they indicate activation at decision time. This means that the bold responses are showing neural correlates of model-free decision. Figure 4b is the difference in activation between model-based and model-free learners at the same decision time. Hence, these are the neural correlates most strongly associated with model-based decisions. We can observe that the highlighted areas are distinguished at DMPFC and FPC. The paper concluded that in model-based behavior there is a greater than baseline activation of DMPFC and FPC, which have roles in prospection. However, the authors noted after further analysis that FPC data showed insignificant correlation. Lastly, the authors set out to provide a new perspective on the effect of prediction error on prospective thinking, because it has previously been thought that prediction error influenced both model-free and model-based thinking, albeit model-based thinking a little less. Just as a refresher, prediction error is the expectation versus reality. In this case, it's the change in reward expectation. So when you no longer receive a reward for a particular response which you were previously always rewarded for, you would no longer couple the result of that response to reward. Putamen, most notably the left, is known to be heavily involved in prediction error. It is activated in habitual, extensively trained, and model-free actions. So figure 5a's putamen bold response in model-free learners during prediction errors re-establishes this concept. But how does putamen activation relate to model-based learners? In other words, what effect does prediction error or change in reward expectation have in model-based learners? Figure 5b shows that putamen activation is below baseline in model-based processing. This means that model-based learners do not experience prediction error because they do not base their reward expectations simply on the previous outcome, but on the general structure of rules of the task. This was also represented by comparing the putamen activation during prediction error against prospective activation that we observed in Figure 3. The graded prospective activation depending on the degree to which the behavior was model-based, and the graded putamen activation depending on the degree to which the behavior was model-free, proved that the positive graded correlation between model-based learning and prospective activity was not simply driven by differences in motivation and attention. In conclusion, the findings support the hypothesis that model-based learning is based on the behavioral and neural correlates of prospection, like FPC, DMPFC, and putamen.
A variety of alternative methods of model-based learning have been put forward. One method is based off a computational model and called the tree search. In this model, individuals plot out all of the possible paths from the beginning to the end, creating a tree of possible results mentally before making a choice. In the generalization model, individuals show expansion of the reward association to all possible paths that end in reward. There is also a possibility that prospective thinking occurs, but not in a model-based manner. However, due to the results of this study, the importance of prospective thinking in model-based learning learning has been demonstrated.
The authors stress the importance of fMRI's temporal limitations because this means that their results can only provide evidence that there is a relationship between neural anticipation and model-based choices, and not how this relationship occurs. Additionally, only 20 participants were included in analyses, and because of this, the results and conclusions may not be generalizable. Finally, the ROI approach may also present limitations. It may ignore possible subdivisions within brain areas that were investigated, and it may miss other brain areas entirely.
Some future directions include exploring the role of the frontal polar cortex in model-based learning. The results of the study did not reach significance. However, perhaps a more region of interest-based approach with smaller voxel size could increase the resolution of the area and show significance in specific nuclei of the frontal polar cortex that don't show up on a more general search. These researchers could also look into whether alternative methods of model-based learning are used, such as the ones discussed previously. These methods could be used in conjunction with prospective thinking, as well as in place of prospective thinking during different tasks. And this leads to the second question of when and to what proportion is model-based learning guided by prospective thinking, and to what proportion by other methods. Is the method task-specific? Do methods differ between individuals or developmental stages? All of these would be good topics for a future study.